Hey everyone, welcome to another Patreon topic video. This one is for Dunpeal, and the topic is shmup music. So how does music fit into the genre of shmups? Why is it important? Why do people tend to gravitate towards shmup music, even people who don't play shmups? And what are some of my picks for my favorite shmup music, maybe some hidden gems and things like that. So to begin with, I think it's interesting to talk about the relationship between shmups and their soundtracks, because if you kind of think back on older style video games, arcade era video games, even stuff, old console games and stuff, you notice that there seems to be a much heavier emphasis on music than games that we get these days, especially mainline major studio games, right? For instance, think about Mega Man X and how important that soundtrack is to the experience of the game versus something like Dark Souls maybe, or some modern FPS shooters, even some modern RPGs really. They're kind of going these days more for that ambient sound, more you know what I mean, less kind of direct connection between the gameplay and the music. Whereas with shmups, the music is massively important for a number of reasons. So I guess I'll start off with kind of the basic reasons why shmup music is so important and interesting. So being an arcade genre, the goal of a shmup, especially in the arcade days, was to attract you to play it walking by the cabinet. So that's the setting in which these games were developed, is they're thinking, okay, we want people to play this game straight basically off the music and the visuals and the attract screen, right? Those are the three things you're going to be able to see, and of course other people playing it. That's going to inspire you to throw in a quarter. So that's the first role of music that's pretty different from modern games, right? Modern games don't rely on their soundtrack to get you to play them. Again, Dark Souls, right? How many people come out and say, you know, I was listening to the Dark Souls soundtrack and that really, I was like, I gotta play this game, man. The soundtrack just pulled me in. I'm sure there are people like that, you know, there are some cases, but with shmups, that's actually very common. I remember Eaglet, when I interviewed him and asked how he got into Garega, he said that at first he really wasn't that into Garega's gameplay and stuff, but the visuals and the music kept him coming back. That's a big attraction for a lot of shmups. Toho is a huge example of, right? Arguably, the soundtracks to Toho are more famous and influential than the actual games themselves. I've had so many people that aren't shmup players talk about how they love Toho soundtracks, and for example, there's a Melee player, PPMD, who, you know, kind of early in his retirement, he was talking about what he enjoyed, and he talked about Mario 64 and Toho music, right? And ever since then, I don't think he's ever mentioned playing Toho games or shmups, but that's just an example of how powerful shmup music can be to get people to come and play the games. So that's kind of the first role of shmup music, is just to get you to play the game, to get you to hear the music and be like, this sounds, you know, interesting, it sounds energetic and fun. I gotta check this out. The second role of shmup music is kind of setting the mood, setting the tone within the game. So once you're at the cabinet, you've put in the quarter, and now the game's gonna set its tone. Especially with shmups, because shmups, what I enjoy about the genre of shoot 'em ups is that their storytelling, or their vibe, I guess you could say, their environment, their setting, is all mostly inferred from the gameplay, from the visuals, and from the soundtrack. So what's kind of going on can be conveyed to you by the music a lot of the times. For instance, in Ketsui, Ketsui has an interesting soundtrack because it goes through different styles and stuff like that. So stage 1 sounds kind of straightforward, and then stage 2 has this weird but interesting dreamy ambiance, right, where you feel like, okay, maybe it's like not straight up war right now. But I remember when you hit stage 4, and I think it's called Defense Line, the track, and it just has the guitars and the drums. That track always gets me psyched up, and it also has this big spike in difficulty. So same thing with boss music. Boss music is always supposed to sound intense and intimidating and kind of scare you a little bit. And in fact, there are some shmups that when you play and their boss music isn't that hype or isn't that good, you're kind of lose the interest there. So that's the second function of shmup music, is to simply convey to you through the sound what the game is all about and what's going on. Another cool thing is that in Sorcerer Striker, I talked about this in another video, the visuals of that game are actually influenced by the soundtrack, because the guy making the soundtrack came up with the music first, and then they listen to the music and they're creating the visuals to sort of match that. Another track that really stands out to me is the stage 4 of Gorega, when you're in the sky and has that kind of it's hard to describe, but it's kind of toned back and deeper, more bassy, but also a little more ominous and spooky. It really fits with the vibe. That's one of my favorite shmup shmup tracks of all time, is Stage 4 in Gorega, so there's another example. So that's the second function of the music, is to kind of set the vibe, to tell the story of what's going on. Another really interesting aspect of shmup music that is a little less discussed or a little less recognized is that it can actually be used strategically. It can be used by the player. For instance, in Dodonpachi, there's a phase in Hibachi where the visual cues aren't reliable. You can't really decide what's going on for the visual cues because they're always kind of unreliable because of randomness and things like that. However, you can always rely on the audio cue. So there's a certain phase in Hibachi where I'm actually listening for the audio cue to when to bomb, rather than any sort of visual indication, because the visuals just aren't there. That's actually a really useful aspect of shmup music that doesn't get talked about as much, as you can actually use it to create cues for your gameplay. So within a certain round of the boss theme, maybe you're like, okay, the second loop of the boss theme I do this, or within the stages maybe. So that's why I would not ever want too much ambient music in shmups, because if it's too ambient, too spacey and stuff, you might not be able to kind of figure out any sort of cues of when to do things. So there's another example of the use of shmup music. So as important as shmup music is to the games, it also kind of is a little bit of a double-edged sword. Because the genre's history with music is so strong, and shmups tend to have extremely strong soundtracks, because again, it's like part of the main thing is the visuals and the music are critical. That does present a bit of an extra challenge to shmup devs, where they can't really get away with bland soundtracks that well. They're gonna get instantly noticed and it's gonna be an issue. One that comes to mind is the Space Moth DX game. I have a soft spot for this game, so I'm not trying to be harsh towards it. I do like it. I just think the visuals and the music just weren't quite there. I think it was a starting point for the developers and stuff, so I don't hold it against them too much, but that Space Moth music just is kind of isn't quite there. It's not finished, so it's not bad, it's not offensive or grating, but it's not quite there. So again, that's an extra, like if they were creating a platformer or maybe even an RPG, maybe RPG music still is also pretty important, but maybe a platformer game or something like that, a puzzle game or an FPS game, those tracks might get away with without too much scrutiny, because it's not such a pivotal part of the genre. So that's a bit of a double-edged sword there, where if you're making a shmup, you have to actually put a lot of time and consideration into the music, otherwise it's just not going to hold up to what the genre is looking for. So another example of a double-edged sword that just came to me is this Korean-made shmup called Shikondo Soul Eater, I believe. And it has a very interesting soundtrack where it has kind of like a glitch hoppy type soundtrack. And so when you're playing the game and listening to it, there's times where like some tracks are just on point. You're like, oh, this is really cool. And then I remember with the boss theme, it just goes a little too far into the glitch hop stuff. And you have to listen to that track like 5 or 6 times. And so when it comes to boss themes and those types of things, You have to be really careful that you put something strong together, because players are going to listen to these tracks for hours and hours and hours on end, basically. Another famous example of that is Donpachi. So what's weird is that the early cave games, basically Donpachi and Dodonpachi, I believe they outsourced the music somewhere else, and they definitely have a limited selection, because Dodonpachi only has 3 or 4 tracks or something like that. A lot of the stages recycle tracks, and so you're going to listen to a lot of the same music in Dodonpachi over and over, and then that's just in one loop. And so if you do both loops, now you're listening to the same track up to 4 times perhaps. So variety is really important, and I would say if you're making an indie shmup or you're making a shmup, do the best you can not to recycle tracks, because that becomes really grating to players after a while, especially people who are investing in your game and playing it over and over and over, and then you're making them listen to the same songs repeatedly. Obviously, boss themes tend to get recycled, right? There's not usually unique boss themes for each stages. I think that'd be pretty cool, but usually a boss theme, sometimes there'll be 2 or 3 different versions, but usually that tends to go throughout the game. So make sure your boss theme's on point as well. So the last part of the topic that I think will be really fun to talk about is just to mention some shmup soundtracks that I think are really fun but tend to get overlooked, or tend to be, well, they're just not as well known, right? So one that is a favorite of mine is actually the Axelay soundtrack for the Super Nintendo. And I have heard this track be used outside the context of Axelay in some random YouTube videos and stuff, and so I think it does have some catchiness to it even beyond the shmup players, right? Another one that I really like, that I've actually not played much of the game, but I've listened to the soundtrack a bunch over and over, is Under Defeat HD. I really love that soundtrack. It's kind of like 80s metal crossed, or like not metal, but 80s hard rock crossed with 80s like synth pop. It's really good. You'll recognize the styling when you hear it. Like 80s action movies or some stuff might use it. Another one from the same Studio G Rev is Border Down. That one has a really cool soundtrack too. It's kind of a little more soul music like, with some electronic elements. That one's another favorite. And then of course Grega, the Rising games, they have amazing soundtracks overall, like kind of across the board. So you really can't go wrong with too many of their games and their soundtracks. Grega's my favorite of their soundtracks. It has Stage 4. I mean, Stage 4 is a killer song. And then the final boss music in stage, I think it's Stage 6, where it has this kind of ominous keyboard stuff going on. Grega's got a killer soundtrack. And then the cave games that stand out to me. So Donpachi does not have a great soundtrack in my book. I think there's some great moments within the soundtrack, like the boss theme, or one of the I can't remember which stage, because again they melt together in my brain at this point, but one of the stage themes is pretty cool. And when you get the 2-all music is top notch, man, especially when you finally get it in the game. You know, that's a great reward. So the 2-all music's pretty cool. As far as cave games, I think my favorite soundtrack in all of Cave is probably DOJ Black Label Plus on the 360. There's an arrange of DOJ, which is kind of my favorite Cave soundtrack, or up there. I really like DOJ's soundtrack, but then the arrange on the 360 version is like the best part of that release. That's probably one of my favorites. Another one is the Vert arrange of Ketsui. Ketsui has a killer soundtrack, and that arrange is really good. Ketsui and Grega kind of have a lot of arranges, by the way, up there as far as shmup popularity arranges. Another favorite is the Futari soundtrack. Oh man, I think it was so good that even during Gus's run at GDQ, people in the stream were, talking about, oh man, this soundtrack's really good. So Futari has a killer soundtrack. The original Mushi has a killer soundtrack. SDOJ, I think, has a slammin' soundtrack as well. I think DFK is probably my least favorite of that era, So the Cave games have amazing soundtracks. So I thought it would be fun before I end this video to maybe do a little bit of a poll in the comments. Just name what your favorite soundtrack is. You get one, just put it in there, your favorite. So my favorite would be, it's hard to say what my favorite is. Probably DOJ Black Label Arrange. I'll stick with that one as my favorite, but you know, there's so many great ones. So yeah, before we head out, let me go ahead and thank my patrons. Dingo, Anthony A, Brian Shiver, Double Vision, Dunpeal2064, Men of the Video, Full Set, Retro Shmupper, Gus, Kiwi, Jacob Spring, Jake Ryan, J Lab, Joe Angelo, K, Kino Tosi, Mark Sloan, Maz, Nathaniel Davis, N Electron, Omcall, Psych, Plasmo, Rhizosis, Sugumo, and Young Money Sui. And if I get anyone's names wrong, let me know. Thanks for watching.